Hey everyone, it's Lindsay and I'm back today with another Card Making 101 video. This week I want to talk about inks. For all my stamping today, I'm going to be using this solid square stamp. This is from Stampin' Up. I've unmounted it and it's just on a clear acrylic block, and I'm going to be stamping on both white and black cardstock so you can see how it performs on both. I'm going to start off with black inks today. Yes, more than one. I use them all. They all have different purposes, and you'll find that when you get more into stamping, you'll see why you use them all. So the first I want to start out with is a black dye ink. This is the ink I reach for the most often out of any other type of ink. Now I have a pad from Simon Says Stamp. There are many other companies out there who have awesome black dye inks. Hero Arts has a great ink, as well as Lawn Fawn, and just you want a high quality black dye ink pad to start off with. This isn't something you want to skimp on. So the ink pad itself is a raised felt pad that is cloth covered. You can see the ink inside is very thin and it's transparent ink as well, which is just true to all dye inks. Now the pad is raised up off the actual holder that it is in, and that makes it easier to ink up all your stamps. Now you can see, because this is a felt pad, it is very firm. It doesn't have a lot of give to it, and the ink itself is transparent on my finger. You can see my finger beneath it, and it dyes my finger as well, which once you see it on the paper, you'll see it actually dyes the fibers of the paper. There's a closer look at that pad itself, and it's nice, tightly woven cloth covered. So when you ink up your stamp, you just want to tap it in your ink pad, make sure your stamp is nice and covered, and then I'm just going to press it down, give it some firm pressure, and I'm going to start on the black cardstock. Now this is dye ink. It's going to soak into the fibers of the paper and dye the actual paper itself. And so this is going to disappear a little bit on your black cardstock. It does take just a few seconds to dry. It's very quick drying. So if I rub my finger over this, it's not going to smear at all, which is a huge bonus when you're stamping a lot. Here you can see it on the white cardstock. You can see it's a pretty fair black ink, and it does stamp nice and solid. Now when I go to wipe this off my stamp, you're going to see it is a dye ink. It's going to leave your stamp stained. That's just the nature of the ink. It doesn't ruin the quality at all of the stamped image that this stamp will give you. However, if that bothers you, there's really no way around this with dye inks. So my black dye ink pad is waterproof, so I use it for all of my watercoloring, as well as stamping sentiments that I want to dry quickly, stamping on not non-porous surfaces but slicker surfaces. This is most definitely the ink I use because it is a quick drying ink. I also use it for colored pencil coloring or just plain black stamping. So the next ink pad I want to talk about is Memento Tuxedo black ink, and this is the ink pad I use when I want to color with my alcohol markers. Now it is a dye ink as well, however this is not as dark of a dye ink, and it also just is a little splotchy at times as well. So the only thing I really do use this for is coloring with my alcohol markers. It doesn't bleed or anything like that when you color with them. So the ink pad itself is raised as well, and it is a felt ink pad, and it has a cloth cover on top. You can see this is a little bit different than my other black dye ink pad, though it's almost a little bit of a drier ink, and it does have a very firm pad in it as well. It doesn't have a lot of give. However, you can see here it is a transparent when I put it on my finger, but when I wipe it off, it doesn't dye my finger as much as my black dye ink pad, even though this is a dye ink pad as well. So it's just not as dark of an ink. There's a nice closer look at that ink pad itself, and you can see it too is a tightly woven cloth cover, so you're going to get good coverage on your stamps. So here you can see it on the stamp, and you can see it just doesn't have quite as much shine as my other black dye ink pad, and it will become more apparent on the white cardstock. It's not as rich of a black color. It's almost has a little bit of a blue tint to it. Now you can see it looks great on the black cardstock. It will soak in and dye the fibers of the paper a little bit like all dye inks do, so it will fade a little bit on the black cardstock as it dries. However, here you can see the results on the white cardstock, and they're just a little splotchy. not quite as black as I would like them to be. However, this is my go-to ink for my alcohol markers. Now, there are a few more types of ink pads that have come out recently that you can use with your alcohol markers. I haven't tried them yet, so this is what I recommend. It's what I'm happy with, so I'm sticking with it. The next black ink that I want to talk about and that I use the most often is called Versafine Onyx Black Ink. Now, I have the mini pad of this because I really don't use it a whole lot. However, it's one that when I need it, this is one that there is no replacement for. This is a pigment ink, so it stays wet for longer. So this is what I use whenever I want to heat emboss something in black. I don't like black embossing powder. It's too much of a mess for me to deal with. So I use this ink and then I heat emboss in clear for that raise effect, and it gives me a nice rich black heat embossed image. I also will sometimes use it for watercolor, but not very often because it really has to be nice and dry for you to be able to use it for that. And this is a pigment ink, so it does take a little bit longer to dry. It is a messy ink to deal with. However, this is the darkest and most rich, and also gives you the crispest image of all the black inks I've talked about so far. Now, you could see it on my finger. This is a pigment ink, so it is nice and opaque. It's also thicker than your dye inks, and the pad itself is a foam pad, so it's a little bit different. It's got a little bit of a give, and whenever I go to stamp this down, and once it dries, it's not going to soak into the paper. This pigment ink is nice and thick, and it sits on top of the paper, and that's what allows it to stay wet for so long. So this is one where if I went and touched it right now, it would smear and it would go everywhere. It is a little bit messy to work with, but it's just one of the pros and cons of this ink. You know, it's got the great image that it gives and the nice black color, but it is a mess. So here I'll go ahead and stamp it on this white piece of cardstock, and you can see just how great of an image this stamps out. Now, this is also a pigment ink, so it's going to wipe off nicely from my stamp. Now, a few things I use this ink for, like I've said before, it can be used for watercolor. If you give it enough time to dry, it does have to be completely dry for it not to smear, or you can bring a heat tool to it to speed that up. Also, if I have a sentiment that is my main focal point, this is the ink I will reach for because I know it's going to give me a nice crisp and clean result. But the main thing I use it for is heat embossing black images because I don't like black embossing powder. Now, here is a final look at all these ink swatches, the black inks that I've covered today. I've got the dye ink, the Memento ink, and the Versafine ink on both white and black cardstock. So there you can see a little bit more of the comparison between the two. But I use them all. I love them all. And as you get more into card making and stamping, you will see that each one does have their own particular use. So 3 may seem excessive, but it's just something you collect over the years. Moving on to colored inks, I'm going to go over pigment, dye, and chalk. I'm going to start off with dye, but I do want to say that these ink pads here are from Hobby Lobby. I was pleasantly surprised at the quality, but I wanted them all to be the same color so you could get an idea of how they stamp against one another. So I'm going to start off with dye inks, and this is again from Hobby Lobby. It's in royal blue color, and the dye ink itself is great for a variety of techniques, as well as if you want a fast drying ink. These are really going to dry fast to the touch in a few seconds. So once I take that lid off, you can see that the ink pad itself is not the color that you are going to stamp out. These inks are very transparent inks, but they are very dark as well. So the color you stamp out is not the color of the pad. That's why the lid itself is white, and it does have the label on it that is colored the color you're going to get. Now, when I go ahead and press this on my finger, you can see it is a felt cloth covered pad, just like the black dye ink. It's very transparent on my finger, and it almost looks black, but when I wipe it off, you can see it's dyed my finger blue. There's a closer look at that ink pad, and then we'll go ahead and move on to how these stamp out. Now I'll go ahead and put my stamp in that pad, and when I pull it off, you can see it looks like I have black ink on my stamp. And whenever I stamp it on the black ink, or when I stamp it on the black cardstock, it's going to soak into that paper and dye those fibers, so it's really not going to look like much on the black cardstock. And this is going to be your big difference between your pigment and dye inks you'll see in a moment. But when I stamp it on my white cardstock, you can see I get a nice, crisp, clean image, and this is going to dry super fast. Now, some new formulas that have come out recently have started to where they stamp out and they look a little bit splotchy, how you can see here, but once this dries, it's going to smooth out into the fibers of the paper, and you'll get a nice, just smooth finish with these inks. Now, it does dye your stamps a little bit, especially high quality clear stamps, but that is unavoidable with these inks. The next ink I want to talk about are pigment inks. Now, right away you can see the packaging is different. It's got the clear lid, and that is because the ink you see on the pad itself is the ink you are going to get when you stamp out your image. That's the color you're going to get. There is no difference. So there you can see the back of the ink pad, and it just shows you the directions on how to use this. Now, with the pigment ink pad itself, it is a foam ink pad, so you'll see when I press my finger into it, it has got quite a lot of give. It's spongy, and it's just that ink will really get into all the creases and crevices of your stamps, especially your fine detail stamps. And you can see this is an opaque ink. Pigment inks are thicker than your dye inks, and that's just the nature of the ink pad, and that's why the pad itself is also foam, so that ink can kind of sit in there, and then whenever you press it down, it can really get into those crevices. There you can get a closer look at that foam pad. And then when I stamp there, or when I put this stamp into the pad itself and pull it up, you'll see I get a nice blue color immediately on the back of the stamp. And when I stamp this down, it's going to stamp out the exact color you see on the pad. And you'll see a huge difference right away with the dye ink pad when stamping on dark cardstock. This is an awesome technique to use with pigment inks, and it just shows up nice and bright on that black cardstock as a background. Now, these are also great for heat embossing because they are a slow drying ink. You have plenty of time to heat emboss with, heat emboss with these ink pads. And you can see these ink pads give a nice smooth finish as well. Now, when I wipe this off, these ink pads are a little bit messy to work with. However, the dye and the pigment ink both have their separate techniques that you can use them for, and they're just great to have both for a variety of reasons. Now, once I clean this off, you'll see it does not stain your stamps because it sits on top of the stamps. It doesn't soak into the paper, the stamps, anything like that. It does sit on top. So just be careful when working with these. You don't touch them right away because they will smear. You do need to take a heat tool to them or give them quite a bit of time to dry if you're not going to heat emboss. Now, the next ink I want to talk about is a chalk ink, and this is basically a reformulated pigment ink, except it has a little bit more of a matte, chalky finish to it. Now, I could not find a chalk ink on the Hobby Lobby brand, so this is Versamark, and this is one of their little dewdrop cubes, and this is also a slow drying. It says fast drying on the back, but if you work a little bit quickly, it can be heat embossed. I mean, it stays wet long enough. The thing I use this ink for the most is blending. It blends beautifully on paper because it does sit on top of the paper just like your pigment inks. Now, you can see the pad itself is a foam ink pad. It is squishy. It's got a lot of give to it. And again, this isn't going to dye my finger. I can wipe it right off. It's a little bit messy to work with because it is a slower drying ink, but they each have their own purpose. There you can see a closer look at that foam ink pad, and then I'll go ahead and show you how this ink does stamp out and show you a little bit of the different finish you get. Because this is a smaller ink pad, I am taking the ink pad to the stamp instead of the other way around, and immediately you can see on the back of the stamp it does have a more matte and not as shiny finish as your pigment and dye inks. Now here I'll stamp it onto the black cardstock. It's not going to be quite as bright as your pigment ink, and remember this is a darker color than my other colors as well. This is more of a navy, the others were a royal blue, but you can see it does show up on your darker cardstocks, so that is a bonus. And then I'll go ahead and stamp it on this white cardstock, and it does give a nice impression. And if you were working very quickly here, you could heat emboss this because it does stay wet. Again, what I use this ink for the most is ink blending. It blends beautifully, and I do have a few colors of these that I do use that for. Now this cleans up just a bit easier than your pigment ink because it's not quite as slick, it seems, so it does clean up nicely. It doesn't stain your stamps, and it's just a great ink to work with. And you can see here on these swatches that you do just get a little bit more of a matte finish. It's not really that noticeable, but if you're looking at them side by side, you can see the difference. There you can see that dye ink pad has smoothed out, and it has darkened just a little bit as well. And you can almost tell that it's soaked into the paper, whereas the other two are more sitting on top of it. You can see that dye ink has dyed your paper, especially on the darker. Now over on my blog today, there is a write-up on all of these inks, and I do give you specific techniques that these can be used for each individual ink. And also just a quick search online will give you a ton of ideas for all the different types of inks and the techniques you can use them for. I want to go into more specialty inks now, and the first one I want to start out with is the one I use the most often, and that is Versamark Ink. Now I have included the refill bottle here to show you just how clear this ink is, and I'll also squirt some on the ink pad later on to show you just how clear it actually is. It has no color added to this. This is called a Watermark ink pad, and basically what it does is it just makes your cardstock a few shades darker. So it's great for like stamping tone on tone backgrounds and that type of thing, but I will get into what I use this for in just a moment. Now here you can see when I remove this, this is a foam ink pad. It's nice and raised off the surface for easy stamping. And this is more of a tighter foam. It doesn't have as many open pores, for lack of a better term. And I'll go ahead and squeeze just a little bit of this ink out and show you that it is a nice, clear, almost syrupy texture type of ink. And it acts more like a pigment ink in that it stays wet for a very long time. But because it is clear, it's not as messy to work with. It also differs from pigment ink in that it is not a slick ink. It is very sticky. So your embossing, I use it for heat embossing most often. So whenever I go and I put this embossing powder on there, you know that embossing powder is going to stick to it. Now my ink pad is well loved. I've had it for 8 years since I began stamping, so it is stained quite a bit. However, that does not affect the ink in it at all, and it doesn't transfer whenever you go and you stamp a new image. You'll see here I went ahead and put it onto my stamp. It's a nice clear sticky ink, and I'll go ahead and stamp this down onto that black cardstock. Immediately it makes that cardstock a few shades darker than it actually is, which is great for tone on tone stamping. I'll go ahead and ink it up again, and once I stamp it down onto this white cardstock, you can see that none of that ink on the pad itself that has stained it has transferred onto the white cardstock, so you can't even see the ink on it. Now you can clean this off your stamp with a baby wipe, and it's very easy to clean off. However, if you're having trouble with your stamp stamping, this is a great stamp conditioner as well. I will have a video later on how to condition your clear stamps. However, if you're having trouble with your solid ones, put some of this on there and let it dry. Don't wipe it off, and your stamps will stamp wonderfully. It gives it a nice surface for your inks to cling on to. So the next specialty ink I want to talk about are distress inks. Now these are unlike any of the other inks I've talked about, even though they are categorized as a dye ink. Here you can see I have the mini version of these. I enjoy mini versions better than the larger versions. I work in a small space, so mini really takes up a whole lot less room for me. These also have refills, so if you're thinking, well, you don't get as much ink, you can refill these, and the refills are wonderful for techniques as well. So the ink pad itself is a felt cloth covered ink pad, just like your other black ink, or your other dye inks, excuse me. However, these are unique in that they don't stamp out very well. You can get away with using them for stamping, and you can get away, if you work very quickly, for using them for heat embossing, because they do stay wet longer than your traditional dye ink. However, these I mostly use for a variety of techniques, and I mean, if you do a quick search of distress inks and their re-inkers as well, you can find a ton of different types of techniques to use these for. You can use them for watercolor. They react with water, so you can do some ink blending, which they blend beautifully together, and then you can do ink lifting with them. I mean, the list goes on. So these are my go-to technique inks, and they come in so many different colors. You are not limited at all with the different color options. There's another look at that ink pad, as well as the swatches, and you can see they don't stamp out that well. However, you can get away with stamping with them especially if you use your clear stamps and you restamp a few times, then you can. But these are amazing for techniques. I mean, I can't even begin to tell you what all you can use them for in this short video. Here is a final look at the two swatches of the more technique type inks that I use the most often. And again, the distress ink I've only shown you in black. However, it comes in so many different colors as well. I think 12 new colors were added just last year or the year before, so you really have quite a few options with that ink. Now I want to get into my white inks, and the first ink I want to talk about is my Pigment Ink pad, my white Pigment Ink pad. Now this is one of those ink pads that I do not use very often. However, when I need it, this is one there isn't a replacement for. So when you need your white Pigment Ink pad, you need your white Pigment Ink pad. You can't find a replacement for it. You can't sub it out with anything else. So my ink pad comes with a clear cover on it, and that is just to keep the ink nice and wet and the ink pad itself nice and juicy. So I do keep that on there. And then the ink pad itself is a foam ink pad, and it's a nice and raised surface. Now the one thing I do want to mention about your white Pigment Ink pads, whenever you purchase, you want to make sure you're getting a nice high quality, very white ink pad. You can get cheaper ones, but they're not going to stamp out as well. So get a high quality white Pigment Ink pad if you want to spend your money well. Here you can see this acts just like a pigment ink would. It's very opaque and it stays wet for a very long time. Now again, this disappears on the white cardstock, and you'll see on the black cardstock it is nice stark white color. This is one I don't use to stamp like white sentiments or anything like that. If I want a nice bright white stamp, I will stamp in Versamark and heat emboss in white. But this is great for techniques again. Just a few things. You can use these to kind of tone down different types of inks. If you've got a color that's too bright, you can stamp this over it and it gives a nice soft glow. You can use it for like shadow stamping as well. I mean, really the techniques for this can go as far as your imagination. This is a messy ink to work with, but again, it's got its great pros, so it is worth the mess when you need it. Now here you can see the swatches as well as it on the stamp. You can see it's a nice opaque bright white. And you can see how nice and bright white it is on that black cardstock. It almost looks like a moon has been stamped out with the circle stamp. So it is gorgeous. And a few ones I would recommend are Lawn Fawn's, Simon Says Stamp, as well as my Ranger ink pad I love. Now the next ink pad I want to talk about is Stays On. This is different from everyone I've talked about before. This is a solvent ink pad. It also comes with its re-inker because it does need re-inked so often, and I don't use this very often, so I almost have to re-ink every time I use it. So when I take this off, you will notice that this ink pad comes with the clear cover on it. This is one you need to replace every time you put back on your lid because it keeps your ink pad moist so it doesn't dry out and harden on you. Here you can see it as a foam ink pad, but this is not as white as my pigment ink. It's almost a little bit yellow. It's very clear or very transparent as well. And this isn't an ink that I use to stamp on cardstock at all. I'm going to go ahead and re-ink this ink pad very quickly just to show you how I do it every time. I just put down a little bit of the ink and then I use a piece of scrap cardstock just to smooth this into the foam pad itself. And it does take a little bit of time to work it in really well so it's nice and even in the foam, but just keep working with it and it will get in all the creases and crevices of this foam pad so it stamps well whenever you stamp it. Now, StazOn ink doesn't just come in white. I've just included in the white because that's the one I have and the one I use the most often. It comes in a variety of colors. This is especially great if you are using it for non-porous surfaces. Now, I lost the footage of me stamping this ink out and I didn't have time to refill it before this video was posted. However, this ink does not stamp well onto cardstock. This is the ink that you want to use when you're stamping onto fabric or non-porous surfaces. It's especially great for when you're stamping on acetate, like on shaker cards or window cards, that type of thing. I've also seen that recommended for like napkins, like at weddings or baby showers, that type of thing, where you really want a permanent ink that isn't going to move at all. Now, this ink does need a special cleaner, and it's a StazOn brand of cleaner. That's what it's called. But you don't want to use that on your clear stamps. So in order to get around that, I use rubbing alcohol to clean my stamps. That's probably not recommended either. However, it does remove this ink, and that is special because if you get this ink anywhere else, say on your stamping surface, or say it doesn't stamp perfect on the ceramic mug you're stamping or the acetate you're stamping on, you can use that rubbing alcohol to wipe it away and re-stamp it as many times as you need to. So that is a bonus of using this ink. And like I said, you really don't want to use it on the cardstock you'll see in the swatches. It's not a great cardstock ink. It's more of your permanent non-porous surface ink. Now, there is a comparison between the two white inks that I use the most often, and there you can see that StazOn ink stamped onto a sheet of acetate, and that is where that ink really shines. You can see it looks awful on the cardstock, but that's really not the intended purpose for this ink, so it is what is expected. And the white pigment ink looks amazing against the dark cardstock, and you do want a white pigment ink like mine does that disappears onto your white cardstock, so you know it's a nice bright white. And that finishes it off for today with all of the different types of ink that I use. I hope I have answered some of your questions about the different types, and I hope I have given you some great ideas on how to use these inks. You can find more information on my blog about each one of these inks, as well as some specific techniques that I use these for. And I also do not have a supply list today because I feel like you need to really go and do your homework, read reviews, because my experience may be different from somebody else's experience that uses these inks. Inks really can rely on where you live as well. It can rely on humidity of the area you live in and just so many other factors. How cold you keep your house maybe. We keep our house very cold, so it's very dry. So my inks stay pretty moist and they do really well and they dry very quickly. So yours may perform differently where you live. So it's something you need to research and really decide which ink pad and brand you want to buy for yourself. I just wanted to give you a little bit more information about each type of ink, their properties, their actual stamping surface, and a few things you can use them for. I hope you all found this video helpful, and thank you all so much for watching today. Happy crafting!